conversation. Marvin, I wanted to start with something that Vice President Gore mentioned in his presentation. He was talking about this study, a survey, in fact, of CEOs and CFOs who were asked if there was an investment that would make their company more sustainable and more profitable in the long term, but would cause them to miss their quarterly earnings, would they make that investment? And 80% of those surveyed said no, they wouldn't. Would you make that investment?
Yeah, I mean, so I completely understand the question and where it's coming from. I can't imagine saying, no, I wouldn't make that investment. And I say that based on real experience. I mean, we think on a timeline that's 10, 20, and 30 years out all the time. I mean, we're investing $25 to $30 billion a year. You don't do that based on next quarter's results. So, I actually couldn't relate to the question.
Yeah, okay. What's the big that kind that you've made, say, in the last year or so?
Well, when you're making 25 to 30 billion worth a year, there's a lot of
yeah.
I'm going to use an example though. We have a large. I think in terms of what's an example of some recent big projects. I'm going to pick one that we started a few years ago, but it's just coming online. And the reason I'm going to use this particular example is because it also helps address this whole question of scale. Mm-hmm. So this project just happens to be gas-oriented. It's converting natural gas into liquid fuels that can be used. It's permanently converted to a liquid called gas to liquids. It happens to be in Qatar, associated with the large gas reserves there. And this is an $18 to $19 billion project on its own. It's one of the largest industrial projects in the world. Right now it has about 50,000 people working on it. It covers the area of about 360 football fields to give a sense of the size. So it's a very large, very complex, very important project for the company, obviously, important for the country, and again, one of the largest scale projects out there. So that's an example of something that is helping us move down this path towards more natural gas and also making it more accessible to consumers around the world. The scale issue is, even though this is an enormous project, when you look at it in terms of total global energy supply, it's just a blip, right? So you think of the scale of that project for one of the largest companies in the world investing in it, but then start putting it in the perspective of trying to shift the entire energy supply for the world as we talk about alternative energies and options that we'll take going forward, and you start to get a sense of how big that really is.
So the climate scientists who tell us we need to reduce our industrial emissions by 80% by 2050. Is that realistic? Can we get that done?
Well, so I'm not the expert on exactly how much reduction we can get to. I mean, we have a lot of people in the company that have looked at that. We work very hard on what we call our scenarios as we plan forward to 2050 and even beyond in some cases. And what we've tried to do is map out, if that's the goal, what's the most logical path to get there? What's the most affordable path to get there? Now, 80% is an incredible aspiration, I think would be my summation of where that sits overall. But also, both in terms of the kind of investments we were talking about and, following on to Vice President Gore's speech, what's more important to me, I have to say, is not the 80% by the middle of the century or later. It's what do we do to take those first couple of steps to actually start moving down that path so that we can actually find out what is possible.
That's an excellent point. And I mean, look, 2050 seemed further away when we started talking about 80% by 2050 than it does today. When in the mid-90s when we began to talk about that aspirational level of reduction. But I take your point that our focus has to be on, the next 10% of reductions, the first steps we take to get on a path, and we have to hope that technology advances and the transition accelerates as it has. If you talk to people in the energy field in countries that have already been very successful at decarbonizing, they'll tell you the first 10% is the toughest, and then things start to pick up. So we have to hope that that's true even at the scales we're talking about. But what do you say? I mean, the Vice President was talking a little bit about greenwashing and about fossil fuel companies opposed to this transition. We know there are there are fossil fuel companies that have been lobbying, for example, in California, against enactment of AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's a proposition on the ballot in November that was put there by a couple of oil companies, not Shell, that would roll that back. I guess the question that I would have is, is it in the financial interest, as some have said, of the oil and gas companies to slow walk this transition? Is there, since this has been a highly profitable business for y'all for a long, long time, is there a natural, nobody's fault disincentive to trying to move into what amounts to a completely new business for you? And what would have to change in the market to realign the incentives? And we've talked about pricing carbon, but what other kinds of incentives do renewable energy standards help your particular sector? Are there other policies that can help realign the market forces to make this move faster?
Well, I think there's a couple of angles based on the questions you asked that I'd want to respond to. And
Sure.
The first thing is that what we're looking for is a rational but also a comprehensive way forward. And so, the idea of, are we going to address CO2 emissions eventually? There's no question in our mind. Thinking long term, it's not a question. We're going to. There is a question of what the first steps look like and how long it will take. But what we want is that rational and comprehensive view. And from protecting existing business, what I'll try to describe is why that's not such a big issue for me. If you look at where energy demand for the world is today and where it's going and the scale that we talked about and the time it takes to shift this energy mix, I mean, we are going to need oil and gas. When you hear people like me say we're going to need it for decades to come, that's absolutely true. I mean, it will be there. We need to look at how do we do that in increasingly more sustainable and more responsibly. But it will be there, it will be needed, and companies like Shell are needed to do that very, very well. So I think that's sort of the beginning element here. But getting a framework in place that it takes a broad a view as possible is important to a company like us, because the alternative is fragmentation, fits and starts, more inefficiency. If I just related it to the U.S., we worked hard on on all the legislation, but certainly Kerry Graham-Lieberman is one that I personally was very involved in. I think we came reasonably close to getting something comprehensive and broad-based there. The alternative to that is I could end up, in the worst case, with 50 different programs in 50 different states. Mm-hmm. And we see that already in something as simple as gasoline marketing. Different regions requiring different mixes and different components and additives and so forth. And it just adds such a degree of inefficiency to the market that it's not good for business. Mm-hmm. And the bigger, more comprehensive programs that have a reasonable runway for implementation also provide that predictability and that certainty that big business actually needs to invest the billions and billions of dollars that it's going to take to start moving this system.
It's been said that with the failure of the Senate to act and now the specter of fewer votes in Congress for climate and energy reform, that we may be moving out of a period of attempted compromise, negotiating at the table between the stakeholders, and into a period of renewed litigation and certainly EPA regulation. As we know, the EPA is coming this winter with a new set of stationary source regulations. Is this destined to be a more contentious time? Are we going to be seeing litigation at each facility between EPA? I mean, there are already in excess of 90 lawsuits filed against EPA implementation just in the district court in Washington. And you were involved in the attempt to find compromise around the table with NGOs like the Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, and others. Are we moving away from that negotiating atmosphere into a more litigious, contentious atmosphere? And if so, is there anything we can do to avoid that?
Well, I'll try to give you a personal view on that. I mean, the legal challenge to the regulatory approach, I think, is would you say 90 cases filed already? I think that's already pretty clear.
Yeah.
And that's one of the unfortunate aspects of it. It's less efficient than the approach we could take, a legislative approach as a country. But it also, sets itself up for legal challenges, and you could actually lock up the system again just by one legal challenge after another. And there's a skeptic's view that I heard for a long time out there that said, particularly oil and gas companies or refiners or others actually wanted it to go to the EPA because they're sure it'll be locked up for decades in that process without anything happening. So I think there are potential inefficiencies. The solution to that is probably the EPA acting within what are the clear bounds, and the law clearly allows the EPA to do. Again, less efficient, but there is a way to start stepping forward with some of that. And I don't want to be repetitive. If you all were in the big session over here, I talked about how we as a company would push for making that type of regulatory approach as market-based and as comprehensive as possible. So we still want to work towards that larger goal. Ideally, regulatory approaches as singular as individual plants, but building systems that could ultimately be linked together so we can work this on a broader basis.
Are you getting any signals out of EPA about what's coming?
Well, probably not different than what everybody else is hearing. So we are in constant communication and kicking around ideas. So, the idea of basically fence line around facilities, setting performance standards, best available technology sort of standards feels like the way it's going to go. I think, like you say, we may see some of that this week. That's about the stretch of what we see right now. And your questions around, so what do we do in the meantime or in the absence of, you mentioned, working with EDF and NRDC and others. That was certainly part of the U.S. CAP approach, which we were part of. Now, it's broader than that. We work on other issues, too. But I think the other thing that happens in the meantime, and you see this in U.S. CAP right now, is all the members are looking at each other saying, okay, the environment's changed clearly. A legislative process looks, virtually impossible for the time being. Do we even continue to exist as a group? Now, my expectation is it will shift and it will change a bit, but this idea of business working together with NGOs, trying to structure something that provides a framework for ultimate legislation actually is a very good process. I mean, we as a company have learned a tremendous amount by doing that. I hope some of the NGOs would say the same thing. So I think we'll keep working that angle.
That's good. For those that don't know, U.S. CAP was the U.S. Climate Action Partnership was an alliance of Fortune 500 companies and environmental NGOs that came together to lobby in favor of a mandatory declining cap on carbon and a comprehensive energy and climate solution, and really changed the math and made it possible for the Waxman-Markey bill to get out of the House of Representatives. And that was the first time that comprehensive climate legislation ever passed one of the bodies of Congress. Ran into a roadblock over in the Senate, but without U.S. CAP, I dare say that Waxman-Markey would never have made it out of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and wouldn't have existed in the form it did, because the blueprint that U.S. CAP hammered out in the course of over a year of negotiations became the blueprint that Waxman-Markey was founded on. So it was really, really important work, and if you will, broke the business veto that had long been exercised over the very idea of climate action. So it was as important as that. One final question on the political landscape. We are, as you say, in a more defensive time here, where U.S. CAP was pushing for legislation and now is wondering what its role is going to be. We're going to be in a place where the attempt will be made again to roll back the EPA's ability to regulate carbon, and another front in the climate wars going on over in California, as we mentioned, the attempt to strip California of the statewide cap and trade, and also its renewable energy standard. Now, Shell has been a supporter of that attempt to reduce emissions in California. And have you taken a position on this so-called Prop 23, which is the attempt to roll back those climate laws?
Yeah, we've been in a position of working with the regulators and others in California for quite some time, and part of that was the build-up to AB 32. Mm-hmm. So we have been in support of AB 32. We're still in support of AB 32. And again, it's back to my comments around the regulatory piece as well. Our role, we believe, and because we believe in this future direction, is not to stop that sort of legislation. It's actually to work with it and try to make it reasonable and rational the way it rolls forward. So we work directly with AB 32 and the framers of that around timescales, around performance standards, around aspects like, not picking the technology, setting what you want as a goal and letting innovation and those that have all sorts of ideas around technology figure out the way to get there. It's working more those angles.
Let's talk about the relationship between energy, clean energy investments and the policy landscape. California's been enjoying roughly 40% of all the clean energy venture capital funding. Some people say it's because AB 32 was coming online. And as a result of that investment, roughly 500,000 jobs have been created in the clean energy sector in California. Now we've got people are warning that rolling back those laws could pull the rug out from under the clean energy sector in California. Would that policy landscape have an appreciable effect on Shell's investment decisions? Are you watching things like California putting in place a mandatory declining cap or a renewable energy standard for your investment decisions? Does that affect you as a company?
Well, I mean, it's a yes and a no, because if you broaden it from California and you say take the world in total, then that system is more advanced in some parts of the world, and it absolutely impacts, our investments, power generation companies' investments, which, back up the chain, impact us. So the answer is yes, it does have an impact. The key point is still, if the rules of the game were clear and the direction was clear, you'd see a lot more of the market force getting behind that direction, creating those jobs. And again, as sitting up here as if you heard me describe it earlier, as a person who represents a company that is an oil and gas company, the reason I'm comfortable saying that, but the reason I feel the need to explain it is, that's an understanding of how we're going to need those resources for the time to come, for some time to come. And it's one of the things that I reacted to in Vice President Gore's speech in not so positive a way. He was describing, one of the technologies we're working with, which is carbon capture and storage. And I think the way it was presented, it came across as, it's very expensive, it's going to take power to do it, so why would you ever spend your money here instead of somewhere else? Well, to me, what that does is that ignores the fact that a big part of the world, you don't have to think about a certain state in the U.S., but a big part of the world is going to be using coal to generate power for many decades to come. So we have the choice of addressing that or not. Mm-hmm. It's not a matter of leaving that sort of technology behind.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, we have to figure that out if we're going to lick this problem. And even if we shut down all of our coal-fired generation, India and China aren't about to. And frankly, we're not about to either. We do have aging coal-fired plants that are going to need to be turned off over the next decade. And so the question is, what do we replace them with? And that's getting back to that question that we were talking about earlier about long-term investment decision-making. Let me ask you this about China. I wrote a piece for Business Week not long ago about a shift in venture capital in the energy sector. China in the first half of 2010 picked up as much clean energy venture capital funding as the United States and Europe combined for the first time. And we know that the Chinese government is putting $9 billion a month with a B into clean energy, and is planning to put $740 billion, according to the government, into that sector, just in government spending, over the next decade. Are you getting into that market? Are you doing JVs in China? Is there stuff that's going on there that we're not getting done here in this country that you're excited about?
Well, we're doing quite a bit in China, and this links back to something we spoke about earlier, which is natural gas. So I'll come back to some of the new renewable technologies. Mm-hmm. But we've moved into China in a big way in cooperation with the Chinese companies to see if we can develop, for example, in China, what's happened here in North America with the shale gas and unconventional type tight gas resources. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room recognizes it's completely changed the landscape in North America. And if you just take it one step further, it's actually completely changed the whole security of supply discussion. It's at enormous quantities, what looks like very affordable prices. It doesn't come free in terms of some environmental impact and others, but relative to what happens today and what we can do in the future, this is all existing technology. Basically, it comes down to replacing coal-fired power with natural gas-fired power. You can make a huge, it's the most quickest, cheapest, easiest thing that virtually any country in the world can do to impact its CO2 emissions. So our investments in China are largely driven towards aspects like that. An enormously fast-growing energy demand. Natural gas is a place where we will clearly play there in terms of supplying the country with LNG. We've signed a number of contracts now with China in that respect, but also developing their indigenous resources similar to what's happened here. In terms of what I think most people think of in terms of the alternative and renewable energy, solar, wind, and others, we have a wind business, and I rarely talk about it, even though it's pretty good size. We're over a gigawatt, I think, or around a gigawatt in wind now, because I recognize, if it's back to the greenwashing point, I recognize it doesn't move the dial on a country or a global basis in terms of emissions or so forth. But it's important. We're learning. We'll probably have some additional investments in wind. I mentioned earlier that we'd moved out of solar, because I do think it's important for a company like us to focus on those things where we have some particular skills and things that are, in sort of the Harvard Business Review speak, that are adjacent to our business. And that's why in the session across the street I highlighted biofuels is another area, very low CO2 emission done in a sustainable way, a very viable existing technology plus something we think we can bring all sorts of new angles on technology to it to make it even more viable in the future. So those tend to be the areas where we think we can have the impact the soonest. But, we've got some of I'm looking at two of them right now. We've got two of the, smartest minds in our company, 100,000 people strong, that think all the time about, new angles on energy, or both, conventional and otherwise. And they've got all sorts of ideas that we're not necessarily talking about because they're not a big part of the system yet, but the ideas are there.
The Vice President mentioned a 5-year path to economically viable solar electricity. How long will it take for cellulosic ethanol to become economically viable? Do you have a sense of that? Is that something that changes the game for biofuels, right? But I don't know if it's 5 years or 15.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's one that's going to have to be answered over time, but I'll give you some estimates or predictions, and I'm always happy to be challenged by my colleagues here if they've seen something recently that I haven't. But we did a look. This is going to take you back a little bit in the question, but we did a look back over the last half a century, and we said for new energies, how long did it take those new energies just to start representing about 1% of the total energy supply? And it looks like for the most, it's incredibly consistent, but it takes about 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so biofuels, more conventional biofuels, are just now getting to the point where they're about 1% of the world's energy supply. Wind power will probably be there over the next couple of years. And so in making that statement, my point is not that that's the way it has to be. So, and I've used the term before that's more of a societal law, not a natural law. You can change that. You can change that through government policy and focus on new technologies. So biofuels would be an example. We've been working in cellulosic ethanol. We worked in algae for a while. All sorts of various processes to speed up, to lower the cost of, to make a more usable product on the other side of the cycle. We've worked on a number of those for a good part of the last decade now, mm-hmm. and the ones that show real promise are starting to emerge. And then the next stage is building some demonstration scale or even small commercial scale plants. That builds sort of the last key element of confidence. And then you take the big step on commercial expansion. So it wouldn't be hard for me to look even at something like the emerging advanced biofuels that look like they're making good sense to say, you're still talking 10 years out or more to start to see it in a very real way.
Mm-hmm. ExxonMobil, one of your competitors, made a big bet on algae-based biofuels over the summer. Does that get your attention when they throw, some billions at something like that? Do you take another look, or are you already there?
Well, my guess is now you're going to bring out the competitive nature. My guess is it works both ways, right? So yes, we always take notice, but I think they take notice of what we do as well. Now we keep an eye on the whole landscape, of course, and have scientists that are focused on that. And that's important. That's an important part of learning how to move things forward, and particularly at this stage of study. You know, most of the elements I mentioned, whether it's a particular catalyst to speed the conversion or to make the more usable product, most of this is done through joint ventures with specific technology companies or with universities or others, because you really want to broaden that pool of thinking coming into it. This is not we do this all by ourselves. Don't listen to any outside ideas here.
Let's talk about deep water drilling. The moratorium is set to expire before long. You've announced a major initiative to ramp up your drilling operations in this hemisphere. Is Shell, as a result of the moratorium, a coiled spring? Are you going to be drilling at a much faster rate than you had been before as a result of having been locked out as an industry for the last 6 months?
Well, so that's an easy question to answer. The answer is no. And the main limitation on that is not that we don't have stored up work now, because every month we're not working out there. We are getting behind on what could be done. But it's done with equipment that's limited. So there's only so many deep water drilling rigs. There's only so much human capacity inside the company. So the opportunity we have as a country in terms of supplying this energy to the country is to turn it back on and let it resume or build back up to its previous pace. That's all you would expect to see over the next couple of years. Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the investments that Shell's announced in this hemisphere. Is this, I think the number was $40 billion over 4 years?
It is. So we've put a number larger than that in the last 6 years. So what that tells you is that we see the Western Hemisphere and primarily North America, frankly, as a significant growth area for energy. So now that goes counter to some of what you've heard in terms of it's all moving east or otherwise. But we do see big opportunities for energy investment here. Over the next 4 years, this is something I think we put out to the market just last week, that about $40 billion. There's still some choices to be made, but roughly $10 billion a year just for this company, just in this market. So that's pretty significant. We'll see some dramatic increases in our production associated with that. And the areas where you're going to see that investment go from the oil and gas side really are the deep water. So back to the deep water, as you questioned me about. We did announce last week the next large deep water development project. So these are multi-billion-dollar platforms put in the Gulf of Mexico for long-term production. So that even in the face of the moratorium, I think we have the confidence as the company that not only can we do it right, but that the system is going to kick back in and start working again, such that we were ready to make this announcement. You'll see enormous investments going into natural gas based on what we've been saying here over the last few minutes, because of the opportunity, because of how the market will drive companies like ours in terms of the type of resources they're looking for, and frankly the supply and the cost benefit of doing that. I had an interesting conversation yesterday with one of the large power producers, and it's interesting how we've been drilling these resources now for onshore gas in North America for a couple of years now, and our confidence has come dramatically up, that they're long scale, that they are really easily big enough to make a big difference. So we're the provider of that energy. There's a buyer of that energy, and it's interesting that only now are the buyers of that energy starting to come up that same confidence curve, because their option in the past has been coal. There may be power experts in here that want to add something to what I'm saying, but their option in terms of long-term, stable, secure supplies has been around coal, and gas was previously seen to be something that was going to decline and even be imported to the U.S. So now their confidence is coming back, and what I was hearing directly from this individual was, okay, we're seeing that if the supply's there, if there can be a reasonable cost expectation around it, we see the environmental benefits, we feel the push to go that way, yeah, this will start to happen. So that's why you see all the way back up the chain our investments driven so heavily into natural gas. I stand up here with the title, Shell Oil Company, and by 2012 we'll make more natural gas than we will oil.
You mentioned price volatility, and of course energy traders have long called natural gas the widowmaker because it's been so volatile. Is the price going to stay low as the demand spikes? I know we got more of it than we thought, but there is a law of supply and demand that kind of tells folks that sub $4 NG is not something we're likely to see in the future. What is your planning tell you about? I mean, what is your scenario thinking for where the price goes over the next decade?
If I could just try to put it in a visual picture, I mean, so you mentioned the volatility of gas prices. Just picture, something that looks like a heart rate monitor. Mm-hmm. That's the way particularly buyers have thought about the history of gas pricing. And with these sort of volumes and the ability of the industry now to ramp up in terms of more production when prices support it and ramp down, so less activity when the prices don't support it, what that does is that has a dampening effect on price overall, and it has a dampening effect on the volatility as well. So there will be volatility, but it likely wouldn't be what we had seen in the past.
Last question.
To be really specific, in case there's anybody here that really wants to know, in terms of a price forecast, we say natural gas in North America in the $4 to $8 range. As you look out over the next decade or more.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned environmental concerns about shale gas and hydrofracking. The issue has been possible contamination of water supply. Have you been studying that? Do you think the concerns are overblown? Do you think it's a legitimate problem? What do we do about it?
Well, I think if people are concerned about it, then it's a legitimate problem. So that's my starting point, and I know people are concerned about it. Being part of a group that has had hydraulic fracturing in its portfolio for decades, I can sit up here with tremendous confidence and say this can be done the right way, it can be done safely. It's actually been studied many, many times by the EPA. It's been studied by most of the state environmental agencies where hydrofracking takes place in those states. So I understand the concern. I also have complete confidence in the technology. But what it tells me, given the concern is we need to move to a whole new level of transparency. So this idea that there's chemicals in fracture fluids that companies aren't willing to tell people what's in it. Well, that's I'll reserve using the word that came to my mind, but it just can't be that way, right? Mm-hmm. You need to be perfectly clear about what's in fracturing fluids and so forth. Mm-hmm. Having regulatory standards raised is another visual component that says a well has to be drilled this way, it has to be monitored this way as part of a hydrofracking process to give the confidence to those that are concerned is exactly where we need to go. So it needs to be an open book and more transparent, but highly, as you can probably tell, highly confident that it easily can be done the right way.
Last question before we go to the floor for more. What was Shell's takeaway from the Deepwater Horizon spill? Did you change any practices? Did you learn anything from what BP went through? Was there any kind of wake-up call there at all, or are you guys just better at this than they are?
Sounds like a setup. It's such a long story which I'm going to make very, very short here. But at its very root, of course, it's an enormous tragedy no matter how you look at it. The first thing that hit us in the industry were the 11 people who, when you heard this from BP, this is absolutely true. These are neighbors and friends of people that work in the industry. It's a very close industry, particularly along the Gulf Coast. And that's the first tragedy. And then you have, of course, the environmental tragedy on top of that. If I could give you some insight into our initial reaction, it was, I think, exactly what you would expect. How did this happen? Why did it happen? Is there anything in our system that could allow this to happen to us? That is frankly the initial reaction. And so, while I describe all of my business with a degree of confidence in terms of how we do it, we rechecked our standards. We rechecked the frequency with which we test equipment, particularly the equipment you heard about in the spill, the blowout preventers, and otherwise. And we checked our system. We said, what do we need to do more, if anything, than what we're doing now? We changed a couple of things, particularly around the frequency of testing. But I think maybe the most important thing we did right away is we took a look around the entire world and said, is there any place on an instant auditing basis that we're not fully complying with those requirements that we have inside the company? And I focus on those requirements inside the company because we drill deep water wells to a global standard that is our company standard. And while not on every aspect in every country, that typically exceeds the regulatory requirements, and it certainly exceeded the regulatory requirements in the Gulf of Mexico. So we don't look to those requirements; we look to our internal standards on how we do that. So that was a good result. We felt good about that. We've worked very interactively with the Department of the Interior and the President's Oil Spill Commission to help to identify, what changes need to be made in the industry point forward. So in some ways it's built confidence in terms of what we were doing before. I think it put a huge bright light on the inadequacies in the industry, which was, can you respond to a spill? So we understand all the comments about prevention and all the efforts towards prevention, but if there's oil going into the water at high rates, how well can you respond to it? And I think by anybody looking at that said that was an inadequate system. And so there's improvements going on in that area. The other thing you saw, Shell and Exxon, Chevron, and Conoco, step out as a group of 4 companies and said, we're going to spend the money it takes. We're going to build a system now. And I understand a lot of people look at that and say, well, why didn't you build this 4 years ago or 10 years ago? But we're going to build a system that can respond to this sort of spill or leak instantaneously. Think of a fire station with a fire truck with the latest technologies ready to go, and I'm talking about full containment systems that could take spilled oil, bring it to the surface, burn the gas, ship it to refineries, and so forth. We're going to spend the money, we're going to do that, and fill that gap in a response capability. So that I could go on and on about it, but that's a short summary.
Great. Thank you, Marvin. Let's open it up to questions from the tables. It's a small room. So, yes, sir. I think, there's a microphone on the way. Please stand up. Please identify yourself.
I'm Robert Pazzo. We met yesterday. I'm not going to ask you about market-based issues today. I'm at City College, New York. We own a house up in the Catskills on the Delaware River over the Marcellus Shale. I don't know if I have to say much more than that. But fracking is a dirty word up there, basically because of the things you said. The industry, whoever's come in, has basically lied to property owners, and in a place where, if you don't know, the Delaware River above New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania border is pristine. We have pristine water. Our groundwater is pristine, and it's probably among the most beautiful country in the United States. And what happens is the drilling companies come in and have a reputation for destroying the topography of the landscape and then polluting the groundwater. There's horror stories of people turning on their faucets and flames coming out. True horror stories. These are. But the point is that and I liked what you said, is the openness in regulation, and the lack of openness in regulation has caused New York State to put a ban on drilling for at least a year, and it's very likely that will be continued for a long time. And it would be terrific if a few industry leaders could come up and say, these are what regulations should look like, and put pressure on people who want to make a quick profit out of that, because in the end, you won't get the natural gas out of western New York and eastern Pennsylvania. So.
Yeah, no, thanks, Robert, for the question. I think maybe just some additional comments on that is because we just made a large acquisition in the Marcellus Shale. So now we're actually one of the largest property owners in the Marcellus Shale. Most of that's in Pennsylvania, but a little bit of it's in New York. And so I'm gonna tell you what this is the conversation I had with the folks in my group that are running that business right now. And as soon as we made that acquisition, they started executing a plan to go meet with the regulators in the state to bring what I would call a higher standard to the way things are done, and start having that conversation about where that standard needs to be set for the whole industry. Because, I mean, I listen to your comments. I know that, I'm not going to spend billions of dollars on these resources if I'm not going to be allowed to produce them. And you're only going to be allowed to produce them if it could be done the right way. And so our goal in moving into an area like that is very much to raise that standard. I was just in a very similar sort of opportunity, deposition, resource, whatever you want to call it, in British Columbia. Was up there last week. And just to give you an example, because I can tell from what you said, you've seen, drilling locations cut in forest, and, you can have, this takes a lot of wells, so you could have a number of them drilled. So we drove into a facility that's the way we develop these resources now, and it has changed a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's one location with 24 wells drilled off of one small location. And the difference is relative to 24 locations cleared previously to drill that for that sort of resource. So I think we're only going to drill where we're allowed to drill and where people will allow us to be there. And where we are allowed to do it, we're going to do it the right way. And that has to be proven over time, I recognize. So I appreciate your comments.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Mac McClure. Thank you for hosting this lunch. It's been very informative and enjoyable. My question is, I've been reading a lot about the brain drain in the industry and that there are a number of critical skills, such as chemical engineers, who are retiring faster than we're replacing them, and maybe other critical skills within the industry. Is that something that's on your radar screen? And if so, where do you see it going?
Yeah, it's very much on our radar screen. It's one, if I was to list my top 6 issues, it would certainly be in the top 6. It might even be in the top 3. Because it's critical. And again, I think about the 2 gentlemen in this room that are part of the brain trust at my company, and the idea of them retiring is a very scary thing, right? Because we need that sort of resource. One of the ways we've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think actually every company in this country ought to be thinking about it, and globally as well. But one of the things we did very explicitly several years ago is we set a hiring target for ourselves every year, regardless of the business cycle. So I think you're seeing it's been particularly bad in the energy business, where it's a boom and bust cycle in every respect: investment, hiring, laying off, and so forth. And so we've set these investment targets, particularly around technical roles as well. And we've said we're going to bring these folks in every year, regardless of the cycle. And that's been pretty successful. We have brought those people in. So we are seeing, you can look over that full demographic now and still see some gaps and some valleys. But if you look back just a little bit further, we see a great supply coming through. If you go back in that conversation far enough, it gets to our education system and which is a whole different conversation, of course, which we also should be paying attention to. But we do recognize it, and we are reacting to that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Joe Fargione from the Nature Conservancy, one of the NGOs that's partner in USCAP. So thanks for your leadership on that. I don't know if I can ask 2 quick questions, maybe. What do you think about, like in the Pickens plans, natural gas for transportation as a transportation fuel? You mentioned 80% is a hard cap to get to, but you think about that's going to require changes in the transportation sector, and we've got all the several options from the electricity side for how to produce low carbon electricity, but we're more limited on the gas side. And then about the Deepwater Horizon, deepwater drilling. And I agree with your point that it'd be great to have a response, but reality is that should never have happened in the first place. And that's there's a failure of regulation and a failure of the safety culture in that company. And so what specifically? I mean, you could require people to drill a second shutdown well so they could close things off instantaneously, or is there some other kind of technical thing that we can put in place?
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. Just quickly on the first one, the idea of natural gas into transportation and other aspects of the CO2 economy, if you will. So I don't talk about it a lot, but the answer is yes. So it's a very small market now. It probably won't be very big for quite a while, but it is a space that we're looking at. I would love to see our production of natural gas go into that channel. I think the most real things that you see from somebody like us is, with some government support, there's this concept of building these green corridors where you have a supply and perhaps heavy trucking routes and that type of thing, where we can then actually start to supply liquefied natural gas and other natural gas fuels on a scale that is big demonstration, and then you could scale up, with some, over a couple of decades, you could scale up quite a bit. In our own business, we have enormous equipment, as you can probably imagine. I mean, everything from big mining equipment to just all sorts of things. And so we will take our own look at efficiency, and we'll start putting natural gas into those vehicles, which, we're working on those agreements with the manufacturers right now to provide a further demonstration. So it's an opportunity, not real big yet, but it's something we ought to be looking at. On the Deepwater Horizon, nobody could say it better than you just did. It should have never happened. I think but if I just say point forward, how do you keep it from happening again? I think one of the things that everybody will build their own level of comfort around it, but the well and activity, the drilling activity standards that have now been worked with the Department of Interior, with the reformed regulator, are at a much different level than where they were before in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I'm not going to let the opportunity go by to say I wasn't doing most of that already as a company, because we look at that and we say this resource requires this sort of diligence around how you do it. But it does raise that standard, and there are things there that are on top of what we do now as well. So, but probably 85% of it we as a company are doing today. But the prevention side of that is the answer in the end. You have to do everything you can on the prevention side. There's several components to this. The next side is if you have, part of what those well standards require are multiple barriers to flow from a well. And you have to be able to verify and test each of those barriers, each of them, before you can move to the next stage in the drilling process. That's so mandatory, right? You have to start doing that. And I think that will make a big difference. That's in the standards now. So before drilling resumes, these standards will go legally into place. But that's written into now the draft of the new standards. The other capability, which we've made a big deal about it as a company, is if then, even in that case, now the very remote possibility a well was to get away from you, what you'd like to have seen in the BP Horizon case, and what you ought to be able to see in any well in the future, is if it got away, you go out and you put a cap on it, not a containment system. So this thing Shell, Chevron, Exxon, and Conoco said we would build is a containment system, meaning if there's oil flowing, we could capture it and keep it out of the water, basically. A capping system means you literally put a cap on the well, and you have all that oil and gas in the wellbore, and you have the pressure, but none of it's escaping the well. And the only thing that prevents you from doing that is if you've drilled a well and put a mechanical design in. This is all done with piping. If you put a mechanical design in that's not strong enough to hold that pressure. So that goes back to the original design standards, and also the capability to send out on a moment's notice the equipment you need to cap the well. That will be different. That will be worldwide, actually, from all the companies that I've talked to. And then the last piece is this well containment system. In now the unimaginable case that you can't cap a well, then do you actually have in existence that's readily deployable a system to contain spilling oil and gas? And that's the four-pronged approach that I think should give us the confidence to go forward.
Okay. And wait for the microphone. Okay.
Yes, I'm with Execunet, and you talked about having a list of top 6 things in your world. Well, not necessarily, but I was interested in knowing, sort of bringing it down to an individual level, if we may, how you decide what to do every day, and what you see as your biggest leadership challenges in this very complex environment.
Yeah, it's I think depending on the hour and the day you ask me, I'd probably have a different answer to that question, which is unfortunate, but I think it's the real answer. But I'll tell you the way it feels right at this moment is, first and foremost, I'm charged with running a business. It's a very large business, and every aspect of that, from making the important decisions about how we allocate capital to how we develop a safety culture in a company, those are all daily parts of operating a business, and some of those I wake up thinking about every single morning. So that's sort of first and foremost. The thing that's changed so much for me in the last couple of years in particular, or a lot of the things that we've talked about here, and a lot of the organizations we talked about here between US CAP and others, is I'm constantly getting barraged with the message of you're not communicating enough and you're not communicating effectively with the rest of the world. People don't really understand what you're doing. You talk about scale, you talk about what resources it will take. Well, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me, but why aren't you telling everybody else that? And that falls into the political arena as well as the public arena. And so what I find myself doing is forcing myself to allocate more time, to be frank, in sessions like today, to spend more time available to have those sort of conversations, because I think we are also increasingly seeing that a very important part of what we do as a business, and finding a path forward. So ask me again this afternoon, it'll be another answer, but that's part of it.
Time for one more question. How about somebody in the back?
knowing that the World Business Forum and probably the people in the room come from a broad swath of industry, we're all trying to be better individuals, better contributors to society, and particularly to our businesses. I think it would be wonderful to hear you, help us with some guidance and insight. What can we do as individuals and leaders across industries to, help take us towards a better energy future?
Well, I think it's a very broad question. I appreciate the question. I'm just thinking what immediately came to mind was Eric and I were talking before we came in here, and I thought about where the subject matter went. He actually mentioned the question he asked me. He told me one of his questions, which was, this kind of short-term response to the market demands versus long-term strategic profitable thinking. I mean, you heard my answer to that question. That's one of the fundamental pieces. But we also touched in that conversation on Katrina and how we as a business and others reacted to the situation in New Orleans after the hurricane. And what it brings to mind is that, yes, we run a business. I think this idea that we run it on a quarter-to-quarter basis is completely blown out of proportion. I don't think it's the way it's done, at least not in my experience. It's important, but it's not the way things are done. And I think making decisions on a market-based financial principles, but also on a truly principled basis as an individual and as the kind of culture you're trying to create. And you've heard me say already today, a large part of that is safety for a business like ours. But it's also treating communities the right way. It's the kind of things we were talking about post-Katrina. I think recognizing that it's not just business, it's principles, and it's a long-term vision of where the company's going. I think if conveying that to all of your people in the company is something I'm trying to get better at that I think is critical.
Well, I think we can agree that Marvin met his goals for communication today. Did a great job talking about some of the really thorny issues that are confronting not just Shell, but this country and this human society. Questions of scale, questions of dealing with these issues as quickly as we need to deal with them. So thanks very much for your time today, Marvin. I've enjoyed it. I think everybody got a lot out of it. And we wish you all a terrific rest of the conference. Thanks for coming out today.
Thank you.